Okay, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Scott. I work in a project called Gitcoin. I think some of you might be already familiar with. Our goal is to grow and sustain open source. And part of that is to use this idea of quadratic funding, which I'll talk about today. Ultimately, I don't have a lot of time. I think 8 to 10 minutes, so I'll try and keep this brief. For those of you who are already familiar with the concept, it might be a bit redundant, but hopefully for most of you, it's a good overview of what we've done to date and why we think it's important. So first of all, what is QF? Like, why does it matter to us? QF is economics. It's about incentives. It's about aligning the incentives between the long sort of like term collective and the short term individual. And it was created by this group of actually 3 people, Vitalik, Glenn Whale, and Zoe Hitzig. Vitalik, of course, I think everyone is familiar with. Glenn worked in more academia on the economic side and also some work with Microsoft. And Zoe actually also is on the economic side at Harvard. And so they asked the question, what does it mean to optimally fund public goods? Of course, so the title of this talk suggests the goal for them was to use something like quadratic funding. And although this formula is not, perfect, I think it is very close to being optimal in some specific ways. So really the goal of this formula is to take the square of the sum of the square roots of matching contributions versus just matching directly or proportionally. And that's really important because say that 2 people donate $4 each to project A and 8 people donate $1 each to project B. The first would get $16 in matching, the second would get $64 in matching, and in total, say there was $100,000 in the matching pool, project A would get $20,000 and project B would get $80,000. And this is very different from traditional matching precisely because every single vote is counted individually, not just the dollar amounts that are contributed. So because 8 people donate to project B, it gets a lot more support, it gets a lot more funding. Now, one of the things that we won't dive into here is how do we solve for civil resistance, which is something we're actively working on. We use a modified version of this formula in practice, pairwise matching, which Vitalik has written about. And ultimately, the goal of this formula is to, create the optimal way to fund public goods, not to solve for that identity problem. So one of the things we've been really working actively on is, okay, what happens if people create multiple accounts? How do you just stop people from scamming the system? And we've come up with some really interesting ways to do that. One of which, from the identity standpoint, is Bird ID, which I would encourage everyone here to sort of take a look at as a solution to the sort of like social network-based identity problem. So again, it's an optimal, economically optimal way to democratically fund public goods. It's a formula for distributing matching to a set of projects, and it's a formula for getting, say, like up to $50 in matching for your project or $1 donation, which is a really good way to sort of get people interested in this idea on the face of it. People want to see those numbers. People want to feel like, hey, there's real potential of like heavy impact in this, like if I go through with this as sort of like with my time, with my energy, all that sort of stuff. So I think that's really important. On a more sort of formal level, the one thing that makes this really optimal is that the amount of influence you purchase is actually directly proportional to the amount that you value for good, which is not true with $1 one vote voting. And it's not true, of course, as well with one person one vote voting. There's a lot of interesting work that Vitalik has done in outlining this. He has a great post on his blog, vitalik.ca, on this point. And I recommend everyone check that out because I won't have time to dive into it here. So we talked about this being about incentives, but aligning people's long-term incentives with, as a community, with their short-term incentives as an individual. And you can kind of imagine this with like a set of heuristic functions, right? So like you have these sorts of like local optima in each of these graphs, and you really want to figure out like how do we combine these into one single global optima. And there's like some interesting alignment in this concept with Bentoism, which I also won't dive into in too much detail here, but effectively, what you're trying to do is say, okay, lots of people will by default value their own time, their own energy. People are often sort of selfish. So how do you create ways for people to not only care about their own interests, but other people's, the community's interests? And then how do you create ways for people to care about the other thing that we notice, that anyone who is in the crowd studied economics knows this, I think, pretty well. People who sort of fail the marshmallow test, so to speak. If you're familiar with this test, like they basically give marshmallows to a group of kids, some people, and they tell them don't eat these for a certain period of time and you'll get additional rewards. People often do eat them. And that's a short-term sort of failure mode. You're basically trying to align your short-term incentives and like get something immediately rather than like thinking through the long-term implications of what you're doing. So that's one of the other sort of like problems here is you're not just trying to align people with the community, you're trying to align people with their future selves and trying to align the community with its future self, with its future sort of like iteration. And so that's really like, aside from the math, I think the really key part of what this sort of modeling is trying to do. And that's what we're trying to really experiment with everything we're doing with Quadratic funding. How do we create this sort of like aligned, this alignment? And I won't dwell on this too much more, so you gotta be mindful of time. So QF is about public goods. Public goods really come down to two things. They should be non-excludable, meaning that you and anyone else cannot be excluded from them. So club goods are an example of something that is excludable. You can kick people out of a cinema. You can kick people out of a sort of like private like chat group. Those are not public goods because anyone can be excluded from them arbitrarily in some cases, and that doesn't really make sense. And when you're trying to think about like what should we be funding, what are the things that we should all sort of support, those things actually are okay. Like those things end up being funded on their own because the people who are part of those groups are willing to maintain them. The challenge is really with these things that are non-excludable. So clean air, parks, roads and bridges. And the other category is non-arrival risk, which just means that like if I try and eat 5 apples, like if there's 5 apples, 95 of them, there's no more. Like it's very finite. The idea of public goods is that like you can't really like take a portion of air and like restrict other people from it, but you also can't take a portion of air and like remove other people's ability to breathe that specific air because it's abundant. So there's this concept of access and there's this concept of abundance, and it's that intersection that creates these things that we're calling here public goods. So ultimately, like the problem with public goods is that there's externalities. There's often negative externalities. So pollution is one of those in sort of like the modern era that's very familiar, I think, for most people. Figuring out ways to solve that is another form of public goods, sort of like tragedy of the commons problem. We're trying to figure out how do we stop people from doing something that benefits them but hurts others. Similarly, infrastructure tends to erode over time. In the US, this is a particular problem at the moment, and people are not really willing to like put in that collective work to solve that. Privacy is another issue. Ultimately, how we let everyone access their own data or choose to share their own data is sort of like a personal rights question or like question of alignment with the community. So that's what we mean when we say public goods. And we think this is particularly prescient because when you look over time, as I said, people have not really been great at thinking about these things in a long-term way. Like we kind of went from this hunter-gatherer age to like an agricultural age, and we improved a bit. We went to the industrial age and we improved a bit more, but of course there were lots of negative externalities, in particular pollution, that came from that. And now in the information age, we kind of have our own form of pollution in terms of the media or data we're consuming, the ways which we access platforms. There's not really a lot of control that we have over these things, and people who are creating these platforms don't really have an incentive to let people learn things that are important and things that will help their communities in the long run. Often people will instead get into like very small fights or are incentivized to like be really negative towards each other in ways that just are not productive. And I think that's a problem for not just like the way we think about media today, but it's a problem of like this. It's an example of this broader problem of public goods being misused. So ultimately, we think Ethereum helps solve this problem in part because it creates this coordination mechanism which aligns the incentives of people who are part of the platforms with the actual owners of the platforms. It aligns individuals with their currencies. So there's this concept of, and actually I think this is maybe a better way to phrase it, like of a crypto city. And like you have, what do you have in the city? Your infrastructure, you've got like your sort of like entertainment, you've got your restaurants, you've got like your ability to, and fundamentally the most important thing that I want to get to here is you have a currency. And that currency in an arbitrary case is defined by other people. You don't really have an input into what that currency means for you. The cool thing about Ethereum and about crypto is that you actually have the ability to program your money and define what those values are in your money. And that creates a completely different sort of economy. So for example, like in our case, the reason we're able to fund public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem through these quadratic funding Gitcoin grants rounds, which although I haven't really talked about them a lot, are really starting to grow, is because Ethereum cares about public goods fundamentally. They care about open source software fundamentally. And that's not something that's true in, say, like the average US tech sector company. So that's a really important part of this in terms of how we actually sustain open source software as a public good, but public goods more broadly. So as I mentioned, we're doing this. We're running experiments in this vein. We're using that formula I mentioned before. We're using these concepts that I've just mentioned. And we've kind of created this grants platform which lets people do exactly what I mentioned. So we've had about, I think, there's more projects than in this screenshot now. There's about 700 projects in total on the platform. Think about like 50 to 100 of them have raised amounts that have fully sustained them. So those projects can now be able to continue in ways they wouldn't have before because of the support of the community and because this mechanism is able to rally the support of that community. And actually that includes Radical Exchange Foundation, which was one of Glenn Whale's sort of like really big starting points for this movement. Although I didn't mention this before, but like he's an economist, he works at Microsoft and so forth, but he also really started this movement around how do we align these individual and collective incentives. And I think that's really cool that people are going back and funding that. This is actually probably a lower match than they got in round 7, which just finished, but I think it's really relevant to dive into. And I think you should all check out sort of like some of these grants. And we don't have a matching round going right now, but we will in round 8 at the end of November. So keep an eye out for that. I mentioned the incentive part. I think I've mentioned that like 1,000 times, but like ultimately the goal here is to show people that really this is how much you could really get as part of this set of contributions. People want to see what the impact is. This was just kind of a neat interface that we used to try and showcase that to people. And yeah, this is like really our goal. It's like, how do we make Ethereum self-sustainable? How do we make it sort of like a treasure, a long-term sort of supported treasure? And yeah, we've been doing that through iteration. We don't think this is perfect yet as an implementation, although the theoretical idea of quadratic funding is amazing. There's still work that needs to be done. And ultimately, that's why we're taking this slow. We've done one round back in 2019 for about 38,000 in total. Then we sort of raised that up to 400 contributions for 56K in total. And then it just sort of took off from there. Now we've started to see, especially with the new identity solution work that we've done, 2,000, then 5,000, then 8,000, and now 10,000 contributions. For round 7, which is not included here, which just completed, I believe there were up to 15,000, maybe even 20,000 contributions in total. So what's cool is that people are recognizing the value of this model and this idea, and it's sort of growing as an experiment. Again, like I know I've shared out to the Talix blog once, but I think he can do a very good job of just sort of like outlining, and has done a really good job in his blog of outlining some of the problems and some of the really cool parts and really useful parts of the experiments we've done so far. So I would highly encourage everyone to look at that as well. And then finally, quadratic funding is helping us sustain our own mission, which is to let anyone work for the open internet. Ultimately, we're really hopeful that you will all be part of that. So thank you all for your time. I think I'm a few minutes over, but I hope you all are doing well. And hopefully, if you have any questions, we can chat about them offline. Feel free to email me, Scott, 2Ts @Gitcoin.co. Thank you.